Welcome to my presentation on rural drinking spaces. My name's Dr. Claire Markham and I'm a lecturer in Sociology and Criminology from Nottingham Trent University. And my research focuses on the sustainability of rural communities and the role of the village pub within that context. So, I'm just going to show a pictorial diagram. One thing we do know for a fact is that there has been a decline in drinking places across England, both in rural and urban areas. And I've always been interested about the impact of that decline on both individuals who use the pub and the wider rural community. Now, this kind of pictorial diagram I've put on at the moment is something I created as a result of looking at the literature, and it just gives an overview as to why I think there's been a decline in the number of village pubs over the time. Okay, and that includes the changes in behaviour of landlords and consumers, changes in government legislation and policies, and changes in the capitalist economy. There has been quite a bit of research done as to why there has been a decline in number of pubs, but my research takes that the next step further, and it looks what the decline actually means to people's experiences and representations of rural pubs. So I'm going to move on to give a case study example based on my PhD research, which looked at the representations of the village pub from various actors and agencies, including publicans, village residents, pub goers and non-pub goers. So a little bit of context to begin with. My research was conducted in the county of Lincolnshire. Lincolnshire has historically had an agricultural land work economy. It's had very low levels of outcommuting. People have tended to be constricted into a geographical area, i.e. their work, home and leisure has centred around a kind of a proximal locality. It tends to have poor infrastructure, by which I mean such as its roads. There are no motorways in Lincolnshire, for example. But it is a kind of an RAF-based growth area since World War II. Currently, it has an ageing demographic. It remains agricultural, but there is a decline in the land work economy. It has high levels of deprivation. It now has high levels of outcommuting. There's been an expansion in the kind of the home work leisure proximity, and it has been a little bit of improvement in the road infrastructure, but it still generally remains poor. So moving on to drinking spaces and practices, past and present. On the left hand side of this screen, you will see kind of how the pub has been traditionally within rural areas, and it's been a place of in and exclusion. It's been predominantly male dominated with local customers, drinking groups and different drinking practices for those groups, and it's predominantly been drink led. Today there are fewer village pubs. It has become more family orientated. It's tended to be more food focused. It remains a place of in and exclusion, and overall it does not form the staple leisure activity that it once did. And the design of today's village pubs is often rooted in nostalgia and the rural idyll. And it's that part that I'm going to focus most of my presentation on today. So a little bit about the methodology. This paper is informed by 66 in-depth interviews conducted in 2010 and 2013 as part of a grounded theory study. The study area was Lincolnshire, and I collected data across 25 villages in total. The interview sample ranged of people with connection to the villages, so residents, publicans, non-pub goers, pub goers. Just over half the sample were male. From those interviews was how and why we consume rural drinking places. And my research revealed that we kind of see pubs as being economically, socially, culturally important, and linked to that there is a pictorial element. So within the cultural aspect, there is a pictorial element. And these latter two areas that I'd like to focus on today. Okay. So the village pub. As a space, and as people spoke about the village pub, they tended to come at it from two angles. And that was from a lived experience. and it was from an imagined experience. And by lived experience, I mean people who have lived in villages a significant amount of their time and been part of that village community, and as part of that, visited and engaged with the village pub. The imagined experience is more rooted in something called the rural idyll, and it's how we imagine the village pub to act and behave, and how we expect it to fit into village life. But what my research found is that these two modes can impact on one another, and the lived experience can impact on the imagined, and the imagined can impact on the lived. And I'm just going to give you two quotes that I think sum up this really well. So the first came from a lived experience, and it was from a village resident who had lived there a significant amount of time. And he talks about how the village pub has been and was been in the time that he kind of visited. And he said, I tended to sit with the same group of people. I enjoyed myself. I still go to the same pub, and sometimes I find myself imagining and recreating the experience I had 40 years ago. The reality of my local is now very different to how it was back then, but let's not talk about that. So this participant was remembering the good things that he enjoyed about the pub, but he tended to kind of gloss over the more negative things that we know from the literature, such as poor sanitation, the smoke-filled room, the spit and sawdust atmosphere, and kind of fitments, the kind of the gendered inequalities. They're all kind of glossed over to talk about the more positive side. And that tended to be a feature that came heavily across within those who had lived experience of the pub. They talked about it in nostalgic terms, but there was a recognition that the pub can be a place of inequalities, and it can be a place where you could be excluded as well as included. So by and large, it spoke about the pub in a positive way, but there was a recognition that there had been inequalities within that space. The imagined experience, this came from a person who had recently moved into the village and had started visiting a neighbouring pub. And this is what they had to say. The village pub wasn't what I imagined. Instead of being a hive of activity with all and sundry visiting, with an open fire and luxury interior, it was a select few residents with a gas heater in the corner and the decor which was dull. The atmosphere was nothing like on television. And this was something I explored quite heavily within my research, was how people came to think of the village pub. And one of the things that came out very strongly is that people who had kind of had very little experience of visiting the village pub or living in rural areas tended to rely on images that they had seen on television. And if the pub didn't match those kind of imagined ideas of how the village pub would be, people became disillusioned. And there are examples in my research where people have then gone on to try and change the pub to how they think it should look, therefore having an impact on the new lived experience. Okay. As I say, this is a very brief overview of my research. There is more available that you can look up, and I will provide references towards that at the end of the presentation. So, the rural pub and the rural idyll. What we can see is both the lived and the imagined idea of the village pub and how it fits in the community is located more within the wider context of the rural idyll. And the village pub continues to offer customers representations of the rural, and the actual physical attributes of the village pub help to reinforce these images. So the village pub is seen as sitting at the centre of community. Historically, it did sit more at the centre of community, but there were still inequalities. But as I said in the previous slide, if more people kind of try and change the pub through gentrification into something it isn't, the one thing that we are in danger of is the village pub becoming stronger in the imagination than it is in reality. And ultimately, there is a buy-in into the rural. We are consuming the rural as well as the pub. They both fit into each other. the village pub is part of rural community as it's been seen historically, particularly in dramas. And if you look at historical dramas, if you look at TV shows of today, such as Emmerdale, Midsummer Murders, the pub tends to have a feature within that storyline. And that is because it is embedded within the rural and what we see as the rural. And that links back to the rural idyll. But it's important to remember, as I've already said, that the village pub and villages more general have been kind of sources of inequalities. Pubs in particular have been particularly gendered institutions. The work of Hay, the work of Whitehead are just some examples of that. There have also been places of class divisions, with the pubs being carved out historically into different areas for different people. And my research also shows that class divisions have kind of intermingled now with length of residency divisions. So there tends to be an area where long-standing village residents kind of congregate in one area of the pub, and you have to kind of perform or behave in a certain way in order to become part of that group. And if you don't behave or engage with certain practices, you become in danger of being excluded or not included within that group. So pubs have been in rural spaces both kind of places of inclusion but also key exclusion. So going forward, what we can say is that drinking places have and continue to hold a fondness in the hearts of many. However, they have changed over time in name, usage and aesthetically. And one of the things that my research has shown in particular is that people tend to like the idea of the pub more than they actually use it in terms of village locations, i.e. it fits in with village life. It fits in with what village life should be. And it's because of that there is this idea that village pubs are so embedded within the rural idyll. But one of the things that the rural idyll fails to kind of think about is the more negative aspects of rural living and of drinking spaces in particular. So if we look at drinking places, they have and continue to be places of inequality, class, gender and residency. But those issues have tended to be overlooked both within the lived and the imagined experience of the pub and rural living more generally. And therefore, the pub kind of is in danger of becoming seen as being stronger and more embedded within the rural community than it actually is. But that doesn't mean that the pub isn't important. The pub remains so much more to society than a place to simply buy and drink alcohol. It is a symbol of economic, social and cultural importance, and those elements are interlinked. And to find out more about those, so this slide just provides you with a list of references from the presentation. It also gives you links to my work. So if you'd like to explore a little bit more in depth about the social, economic and cultural discussions that I raise within my work, please feel free to click on the links or source my work. Thank you for listening.